Matt, what would you say the parallels are between UkraineGate and RussiaGate, and how did RussiaGate kind of lay the framework for and maybe even help inspire UkraineGate and Trump's impeachment or potential impeachment?
Well, it's the same people, first of all. I mean, I think that's you got a similar cast of characters. You've got the same, sort of former and current and former intelligence officials, people from all the different intelligence agencies. You've got the ex, Brennan, Clapper, and Comey all speaking out about it. You have Adam Schiff as your front person, and Gerald Nadler. All this is essentially like the last act of RussiaGate that was delayed when the Mueller report didn't come out the way everybody expected it to. I think the expectation within the party was that the Mueller report was going to set lay the foundation for an impeachment movement. And when the report didn't come out the way they wanted to, the first thing they tried was to have Mueller come on and be the movie that would sell it better than the book of the Mueller report, and that failed. And so this is now sort of just the next step. I mean, it's obviously a different set of facts, and I think it's been notable that people don't want to talk about RussiaGate at all. They want us to talk about UkraineGate as if it's a completely new story that doesn't have any sort of background at all. Because I think the previous facts of RussiaGate were so adverse and so absurd. But there's lots of superficial similarities in that, the story begins with a conscience-stricken insider within like the intelligence community who has a secret report that has to surface, and it's leaked out in piecemeal and breadcrumb fashion in the media, and then there's followed by an investigation and in public hearings. So there are a lot of superficial similarities, but the main thing is it's the same people, it's the same premise, the same underlying subtext of an offense against the national security establishment, his refusal to go along with the national security consensus, the need to oppose Russian aggression in the Donbass and all of that. So I think there's a lot of similarities there, and psychologically it's very, very similar.
And what I also find interesting is that the issue here is Trump supposedly asking for a quid pro quo to investigate the Biden family's corruption in Ukraine, which is a funny parallel to RussiaGate because that was also exposing what was happening in the DNC and
Right.
the Hillary Clinton campaign. So it seems like a funny sort of parallel where you're wanting to blame the people who are trying to expose something as opposed to the underlying corruption.
Well,
Aaron,
sorry to interrupt before Aaron gets this, because Aaron has already talked about this with the recent British story, where you had that sudden headline in the Telegraph about how the Russians were behind the leaking of the document of the DHS negotiations between the United States and the UK. It's exactly the same thing. It's a revelation about some kind of insider corruption within the kind of neoliberal political establishment. We're suddenly shifting focus to make it a story about Russian interference, and we're simultaneously placing that corruption and linking it to some kind of outsider figure, political figure who has to bear the burden of that. I mean, I think you've talked about that, right?
Well,
Yeah.
it's
Aaron, yeah.
exactly the same thing. So you have these talks exposed between the U.S. and the Tory British government about basically privatizing the NHS, the National Health Service in Britain. That gets exposed. Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour opposition leader, publicizes it. Shortly afterwards, you have all of a sudden claims that all this is the work of a Russian intelligence operation. No one's questioning the authenticity of the leaked documents. But they're saying that it was stolen and released by Russia. The source for this claim is none other than the Atlantic Council. The Telegraph story that released this called them independent researchers, but then later on identifies them as being from the Atlantic Council. And who's the Atlantic Council? The Atlantic Council is a major Washington think tank funded by major donors, including the U.S. and British governments. So these are your independent researchers. And now Corbyn and everyone's going along with it. Is Corbyn helping to spread Russian propaganda? It's the exact same thing. And it's the playbook. It's why RussiaGate was not just about, it was not just about, an effort by the national security state and failed neoliberals to challenge Trump in the limited way that they could. It was also a way to discredit the left because, Bernie Sanders almost won in 2016, and he might have taken the nomination if not for the Democratic Party corruption that the stolen Democratic Party emails exposed. And his rise was a major threat to the neoliberal establishment. And instead of embracing the trend that he brought forward and embracing the mass movement that he worked to build, they needed something else. And so they needed fear mongering and tainting their opponents as being backed by a foreign power as one of the few options that they had left. So now they're repackaging that, using that against Jeremy Corbyn as he appears, as he threatens to win victory in Britain. So it's a convergence of cynical interests in this way, is not just against Trump, but also against progressives. And let me say about UkraineGate, where it comes from. I think we have to look at it in the context of the geopolitical reality since the fall of the Soviet Union, where basically since then, in contrary to what the U.S. promised the Soviet Union, which is that the U.S. would not expand NATO to the east, the U.S. has done the exact opposite. It's been expanding NATO pretty much right up to Ukraine, to Russia's borders. And the coup in Ukraine in 2014 was the latest step in that, and the latest effort to basically bring Ukraine into Russia's orbit. That set off this proxy war that is now ongoing in Ukraine between the U.S. and Russia. And Trump briefly freezing this military aid, which is what it's called, but really it's money to buy U.S. weapons, was a potential threat to that. And so I think that's why you saw this outrage in the national security state. And again, when you have Democrats who don't have really anything to offer voters because they don't want to threaten the system that they benefit from, then going along with the national security state and their opposition to Trump is really one of the few options they have. And that's what I think helps explain why we have, once again, UkraineGate, like RussiaGate, consuming the country.